Good God. The retired four-star general pushed back his chair so abruptly that every conversation in the ballroom stopped. His eyes were locked on the faded Navy watch on my wrist. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I glanced around the room. Nearly 200 people had gone silent. Bank presidents, judges, developers, politicians, the wealthiest people in Charleston. My husband looked annoyed. The general took another step toward me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly unsteady. "That watch? Where did you get it?" I swallowed. It belonged to my father. What was his name? I hesitated. Then I answered. Captain Michael Whitaker. The color drained from the general's face. For a moment, he looked 20 years older. Then he shot to his feet. Captain Whitaker's daughter. The room became so quiet I could hear glasses being set down. My husband stared at the general as if he'd lost his mind. The general looked at me, then at Richard, then back at me, and that's when he said the words that changed everything. "Good God." He shook his head slowly. "He has no idea who you are." That moment became the talk of Charleston for months. But to understand why it happened, you have to understand who I was before that night and who my husband believed I was. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I'm 58 years old, retired from the United States Navy, and for most of my life, I was perfectly comfortable being overlooked. I grew up in military housing, the kind with thin walls and squeaky floors, the kind where every family on the block knew what deployment felt like. My father served in the Navy for nearly 3 decades. My grandfather had served before him. Military service wasn't something extraordinary in our family. It was simply what people did. My father used to say something that stayed with me my entire life. Character is what remains when nobody is watching. He believed it, lived it, expected it. We weren't rich, not even close. My mother clipped coupons. We drove used cars. Vacations usually meant visiting relatives instead of resorts. But I never felt deprived, because in our home, respect mattered more than money. Duty mattered more than recognition. And integrity mattered more than appearances. Those lessons eventually carried me into the Navy myself. I served for over 25 years, most of it quietly. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't famous. I simply did my job. When I retired as a commander, I felt proud of my career and grateful for the people I'd served alongside. A few years later, I met Richard. At first, he seemed charming, confident, successful. He owned a thriving real estate development company in Charleston. He could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. People liked him. Investors trusted him. And after years of military life, I found his confidence refreshing. We married when I was 46. For a while, things were good, or at least I thought they were. Looking back, I can see signs I ignored. Small comments, subtle dismissals, tiny moments that seemed harmless at the time. Richard measured success differently than I did. To him, accomplishments had dollar signs attached. The size of your house, the make of your car, the club you belonged to, the people who returned your phone calls. I didn't think much of it initially. Everyone has different priorities. But over the years, those differences became harder to ignore, especially when it came to my family. Richard never openly insulted them. Not at first. He simply dismissed them. Whenever conversations turned toward family histories, he'd happily discuss wealthy entrepreneurs, local business leaders, and prominent Charleston families. When my family came up, his interest vanished. One evening, years earlier, he had looked through an old photo album, pictures of my father, my grandfather, military ceremonies, ships, deployments, uniforms. He closed the album. "Interesting," he said. That was it. Interesting. As though decades of service could be summarized in a single word. I remember feeling disappointed. Not angry, just disappointed. Still, I let it go. I always let things go. Perhaps that's one of my flaws. My father believed dignity often meant remaining silent. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. The charity gala took place in early spring, one of Charleston's largest annual fundraising events. Black ties, formal gowns, crystal chandeliers, expensive wine, the kind of evening Richard loved. He spent weeks preparing, choosing suits, meeting donors, planning conversations. I attended because I was his wife, nothing more. The ballroom overlooked the harbor. As the sun disappeared beyond the water, the room filled with laughter and networking. Richard moved effortlessly among the guests. I followed along politely, shaking hands, making conversation, listening more than speaking. At one point, we joined a table filled with local business leaders, a banker, a state judge, several prominent donors. One woman smiled warmly. "So, Sarah, tell us about your family. A simple question, the kind people ask every day." Before I could answer, Richard laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not yet, just an amused one. "Oh, her family." He took a sip of wine. "They're military people." The table nodded politely. Richard shrugged. "A family of nobodies, really." Several guests chuckled awkwardly. One man smiled. Another looked uncomfortable. Nobody challenged him. Nobody knew what to say. And for a moment, neither did I. The words weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, but they landed harder than he realized. A family of Nobodies. I thought about my grandfather crossing the Pacific during World War II. I thought about my father spending months at sea. I thought about military funerals, folded flags, sacrifices, long absences, missed birthdays, years of service, a family of nobodies. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not anger, not exactly, more like sadness. The kind that comes when someone you love reveals a truth about themselves, a truth you've been avoiding for years. I looked down at my wrist. My father's old Navy watch rested beneath the cuff of my dress sleeve. The metal was worn smooth from decades of use. I still wore it on special occasions, not because it was valuable, because it reminded me who I came from and who I wanted to be. I could have corrected Richard, could have argued, could have listed accomplishments, ranks, awards, history. Instead, I remembered my father's voice. Never chase validation. So I stayed quiet. The conversation moved on. The guests forgot about the comment, or so I thought. Across the ballroom, an elderly gentleman had stopped walking. He was staring directly at my wrist. His expression had completely changed. At first, I didn't recognize him. Then, realization struck. The man wasn't just another guest. He was General Thomas Bradley, one of the most respected military leaders of his generation. And he was walking straight toward me, slowly, deliberately, without taking his eyes off my father's watch. The closer he came, the more serious his expression became. And suddenly I knew something extraordinary was about to happen. General Thomas Bradley stopped beside our table. The room didn't notice him at first. Most people were busy talking, sipping wine, or discussing business deals, but I noticed, and so did Richard. The general wasn't looking at anyone else. His eyes remained fixed on the old Navy watch resting on my wrist. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had spent decades commanding troops. "May I ask you something?" I stood politely. "Of course, General." He pointed gently toward the watch. "Where did you get that?" I glanced down. The watch looked ordinary. The stainless steel case was scratched. The leather band had been replaced years ago. Nothing about it suggested importance. "It belonged to my father," I said. The general's expression tightened. "Your father?" "Yes, sir." The table had grown quiet. Nearby guests were beginning to pay attention. General Bradley stepped closer. What was his name? Something about his tone made my heart beat faster. I wasn't sure why. Captain Michael Whitaker. For a second, the general simply stared at me. Then all color seemed to leave his face. His eyes widened. The reaction was so sudden that several people noticed immediately. Even Richard looked confused. The general whispered something under his breath. Then he stood completely upright. "Captain Whitaker's daughter," I nodded. "Yes, sir." His hands trembled slightly. Not from age, from emotion. The room around us continued growing quieter. Conversations faded. People sensed something important was happening. General Bradley took a slow breath. Then, to my complete surprise, he extended his hand. Not casually, respectfully, almost formally. I shook it. He looked directly into my eyes. I haven't heard that name spoken in nearly 20 years. I didn't know what to say. My father had been gone for almost a decade. Outside military circles, few people remembered him. Richard glanced between us. "I'm sorry," he interrupted politely. "Do you know Sarah's father?" The general turned toward him. The expression on his face changed instantly. Not hostile, not angry, simply astonished. "Know him?" He looked back at me, then back at Richard. "My son, some men spend an entire lifetime hoping to possess half the courage Michael Whitaker had." The table fell silent. Every single person was listening now. Richard forced a smile. "I'm sure he was a fine officer." The general's eyebrows lifted. A fine officer. He almost laughed. "No." He shook his head. "Captain Whitaker was far more than that." Someone nearby pulled out a chair for the general. Instead of sitting, he remained standing as though the memory itself demanded respect. Guests from nearby tables had begun drifting closer. Nobody wanted to miss whatever story was unfolding. General Bradley looked at me. "Did your father ever tell you about the North Atlantic incident?" I frowned. "No, sir." A faint smile crossed his face. "Of course he didn't." That sounded exactly like my father. He never spoke about his accomplishments, never. As a child, I often learned more about his career from other sailors than from him. The general folded his hands. Most of it remained classified for years. Now people were openly gathering around us. The ballroom had become unusually quiet. Even the live music seemed distant. The general continued, 40 years ago, during the Cold War, your father's ship encountered a crisis in the North Atlantic." He paused. "I can't discuss every detail even now, but I can tell you this." His voice softened. "There were young sailors aboard who should not have survived that night." I listened carefully. I'd never heard this story. Not once. The general looked toward the harbor, visible through the ballroom windows, as if seeing another time. Conditions were terrible. Equipment failures, dangerous seas, a chain of events nobody expected. He returned his gaze to me. "Your father refused to abandon his people." I felt a lump form in my throat. The general continued. "He stayed where the danger was greatest." The room remained completely silent. He personally led rescue efforts for hours. Someone nearby whispered, "My God." The general nodded. Several men later credited him with saving their lives. I stared at him. "Why didn't he ever tell us?" The general smiled sadly. "Because men like your father rarely do." That answer felt painfully familiar. My father never talked about medals, never discussed recognition. Whenever someone praised him, he changed the subject. Growing up, I thought all military families were like that. Only later did I realize how unusual he truly was. Richard shifted uncomfortably. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The confidence he normally carried seemed to be fading. The general noticed. Everyone noticed. And then came the moment that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. A wealthy donor standing nearby asked a question. If Captain Whitaker was so respected, why haven't we heard of him? The general smiled. Because he spent his life avoiding attention. A few people nodded. The donor looked surprised, but surely he received awards. Oh, he did. The general chuckled softly, many of them. Then he looked directly at me. I assume he never displayed them. I laughed, despite myself. No, sir, of course not. The general shook his head. That's exactly what I expected. The crowd laughed gently. For the first time all evening, I felt warmth instead of embarrassment. Not because of the attention, because someone understood my father, truly understood him. The general's voice became more serious. Do you know why people respected Michael Whitaker? I shook my head. He answered immediately. Because he never cared about recognition. His eyes swept across the ballroom, across the expensive suits, the designer dresses, the luxury watches, the symbols of success. He cared about people. Nobody spoke. The message hung in the air. I saw several veterans in attendance nod quietly. They understood. Maybe better than anyone. The general looked toward Richard. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then he asked a simple question. Sir, how long have you been married? Richard blinked. 12 years. 12 years. The general repeated the word slowly. Then he looked genuinely stunned. 12 years. And you never learned who her father was. A few people shifted awkwardly. Richard's face wrined. I knew he served in the Navy. The general stared at him, then at me. Finally, he shook his head. That's when he spoke the words everyone would later repeat across Charleston. Words that would spread through country clubs, veteran halls, and dinner tables for months. Good God. His voice was barely above a whisper. He has no idea who you are. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I felt every eye turn toward me. For the first time all evening, Richard looked genuinely shaken. And deep inside, I realized something important. This wasn't about my father's reputation. It wasn't about military honors. It wasn't even about the watch. It was about respect. For 12 years, my husband had never truly tried to understand where I came from. And now, in front of the entire city elite, that truth was becoming impossible to ignore. As the general prepared to tell the rest of the story, I saw something in Richard's eyes I had never seen before. Fear. For several seconds after General Bradley spoke those words, nobody in the ballroom said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. The kind of silence that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they've misunderstood something important. I glanced at Richard. His expression had changed completely. The confident smile he had worn all evening was gone. For perhaps the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain. General Bradley remained standing beside me. The old soldier seemed less interested in impressing anyone than in correcting a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding wasn't about my father. It was about what makes a life meaningful. A woman standing near the front finally broke the silence. What? General Bradley? She asked gently. Was Captain Whitaker really that respected? The general smiled. Then he gave an answer I'll never forget. No. Several people looked confused. Then he continued. He was more respected than most people in this room can imagine. A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. Not mocking laughs. Nervous ones. The general turned toward me. Sarah, your father would probably be furious with me right now. That made me laugh. You're probably right. The crowd laughed with us because Michael hated attention. The general shook his head. Absolutely hated it. He looked around the room. I spent years trying to convince him to accept public recognition. What happened? Someone asked. He always found a reason to avoid it. More laughter. The general pointed at me. Looks like his daughter inherited that habit. I smiled. That much was true. As the crowd settled in, General Bradley began sharing stories. Not classified stories, not dramatic movie scenes, just moments that revealed character. The kind of stories military people tell about those they admire. "There was a young sailor once," the general said. "He made a serious mistake during a deployment." The general folded his hands behind his back. The sort of mistake that could have ended a career. Several veterans in the room nodded knowingly. "The military can be unforgiving," the general continued. "Most officers would have protected themselves." He looked toward me. "Your father protected the sailor instead." A man nearby frowned. He took the blame. In a way, the general nodded. He accepted responsibility because he believed leaders own failures before they claim successes. I felt my throat tighten. That sounded exactly like my father. Exactly. The general smiled. "The young sailor stayed in the Navy." "What happened to him?" a woman asked. The general's smile widened. "He eventually became an admiral." The room erupted in surprised laughter. "You're kidding." "No." The general chuckled. "That admiral still tells the story." I found myself looking down at my father's watch. For years, after his death, I'd worried that people would forget him. Not because he needed recognition, because he had mattered. Now I was learning how many lives he had quietly touched. One story led to another and another. The ballroom had transformed from a charity gala into something closer to a reunion. Veterans approached. Retired officers, former service members, people I'd never met. Several recognized my father's name immediately. One elderly Marine shook my hand. "I served alongside your father once." His eyes glistened. "Best officer I ever met." A retired Navy chief nodded. "Same here." Another veteran smiled. "Your grandfather wasn't bad either." That surprised me. "You knew my grandfather." "Everybody knew your grandfather." The man laughed. I couldn't help smiling. My grandfather had served in World War II. Growing up, he rarely discussed combat. Most of his stories involved fellow sailors, practical jokes, or life lessons. Only after his death did we discover the extent of his military record, the medals, the combinations, the citations. Even then, my family kept most of it private. That's simply how we were raised. As conversations continued, memories began flooding back. I found myself drifting into childhood. Back to a small Navy house in Norfolk. Back to evenings around the kitchen table. Back to lessons I didn't fully appreciate until adulthood. My father never preached. He taught through example. Every Saturday morning, he volunteered somewhere. Sometimes veterans groups, sometimes community projects, sometimes helping neighbors. When I was young, I assumed everyone did those things. Later, I realized many people didn't. One summer afternoon, I asked him why he spent so much time helping strangers. His answer stayed with me. "Because someday you'll need help too." That was it. No speech, no lecture, just simple wisdom, the kind that grows more meaningful with age. Meanwhile, Richard remained unusually quiet. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. For years, he judged my family according to standards that made sense in his world. Net worth, influence, connections, status. Now those measurements suddenly seemed inadequate. People weren't gathering around me because my family had been wealthy. They weren't impressed by business success. They were responding to something deeper. Character, service, legacy, values, things money couldn't purchase. And Richard was beginning to realize it. Eventually, a wealthy businessman approached our group. I'd seen him at previous charity events, the sort of man whose name appeared regularly in local newspapers. He looked at me thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He gestured toward the growing crowd. Why didn't you ever tell people about any of this? The question seemed to fascinate everyone. Several people leaned closer, waiting. I thought carefully before answering. Then I smiled. Because my father taught me that service isn't something you brag about. The room fell quiet again. Not because my answer was profound. Because it was simple. And sometimes simple truths land the hardest. The businessmen nodded slowly. I think that's something we've forgotten. Several people murmured in agreement. Even Richard. A few minutes later, General Bradley approached me. Once more. His expression had grown thoughtful, almost emotional. There's something else you should know. What is it? He looked around the room, then lowered his voice slightly. Your father and grandfather didn't just serve. I frowned. What do you mean? The general smiled. Have you ever wondered where the Whitaker Scholarship Fund came from? I blinked. Of course, I knew the scholarship fund. It provided financial assistance to military widows and children. My family had supported it for years, but I'd always assumed it was created by a larger organization. The general shook his head. Your grandfather started it. My eyes widened. What? Your father expanded it. I stared at him. Nobody ever told me that. They didn't want credit. The answer came immediately. Of course it did. That was exactly what my family would do. The general smiled sadly. 3 generations of your family spent their lives helping people without asking for recognition. He glanced toward Richard, then back to me. That's a rare thing these days. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine shame appear on my husband's face. Not embarrassment, not discomfort, something deeper. The painful realization that he'd spent years misunderstanding the people who had shaped the woman he married. And as I looked into his eyes, I began wondering whether our marriage had been built on something missing from the very beginning. Respect. That question followed me for the rest of the evening, and before the night was over, it would become impossible to ignore. The gala ended shortly before midnight. By then, the story had spread through nearly every corner of the ballroom. People who had barely noticed me at the beginning of the evening were stopping to shake my hand on their way out. Veterans thanked me for my family's service. Several people shared stories about parents, siblings, or children who had served in the military. One woman hugged me unexpectedly. My husband was Navy, she said softly. He passed away 3 years ago. I squeezed her hand. No long speech was necessary. Some experiences don't require explanation. We simply understand one another. The ride home was unusually quiet. Richard drove. I looked out the passenger side window. Charleston's historic streets were nearly empty. Streetlights reflected across old brick buildings. The harbor breeze moved gently through the palms. Normally, Richard loved discussing social events after they ended. Who attended? Who donated? Who made important connections tonight? He said almost nothing. Neither did I. The silence stretched for nearly 20 minutes. Finally, he spoke. I had no idea. His voice sounded smaller than usual. I kept looking out the window. No, you should have told me. I turned toward him. For a moment, I simply stared. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my heart for years. Would it have mattered? Richard didn't answer immediately. And that silence told me everything. The next morning, I woke early. Old Navy habits die hard. Coffee at 6, local newspaper, quiet reflection before the world starts moving. Richard was already awake. That surprised me. Normally, he slept later on weekends. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee. His expression looked troubled. Not tired. Troubled. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him. Neither of us spoke. Eventually, he sighed. I embarrassed myself. I nodded. Yes. He looked down. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I considered that, then answered honestly. Richard, that's exactly how you meant it. His eyes lifted. I continued. You just didn't expect anyone to challenge it. The truth hung between us. Neither pleasant nor cruel, simply true. Over the next few days, something unusual happened. People started talking. Charleston is a beautiful city. It's also a small city in many ways. News travels fast, especially among social circles. By Monday afternoon, Richard had received multiple phone calls. Some were supportive, others weren't. A retired judge who had attended the gala called him directly. A longtime business associate made a pointed comment during lunch. Several veterans involved with local charities expressed disappointment. Nobody attacked him. Nobody publicly humiliated him. That wasn't the culture of the people involved. Instead, they did something far more uncomfortable. They held him accountable quietly, respectfully, firmly. And Richard wasn't used to that. A week later, I overheard part of a phone conversation in his office. The door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't eavesdropping. His voice simply carried down the hallway. What do you mean they're reconsidering? Pause. No, that's ridiculous. Longer pause. I heard frustration entering his voice. Because of one comment, another pause, then silence. A few moments later, he ended the call. When he emerged, he looked angry. Not at me, at the situation. What happened? I asked. He rubbed his forehead. Nothing. I waited. Eventually, he sighed. A veterans organization withdrew support from one of our projects. I nodded slowly. I see. They said my comments raised concerns about leadership. I looked at him carefully. And what do you think? His jaw tightened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he walked away. Glad. As the weeks passed, the consequences continued. Nothing dramatic. No public scandal. No ruined career. This wasn't that kind of story. Instead, Richard experienced something unfamiliar. People began seeing him differently. Not because of a mistake, because of what the mistake revealed. Character matters, especially to older Americans, especially to veterans, especially to people who spent their lives valuing service over status. Richard was discovering that lesson firsthand, and he hated it at first. One evening, about 3 weeks after the gala, we attended a charity board meeting. Several people greeted me warmly. One retired colonel shook my hand. Another volunteer asked about my father. The interactions were friendly, natural, nothing excessive. Yet I noticed something. Richard noticed it too. The respect people showed me had nothing to do with wealth, nothing to do with social standing, nothing to do with influence. It came from values, from service, from reputation. And for perhaps the first time in his life, Richard realized those things couldn't be purchased. That night, after we returned home, the conversation we'd both been avoiding finally happened. We sat on the back porch overlooking our yard. The spring air felt cool. Crickets chirped in the distance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I broke the silence. Why did you say it? Richard stared into the darkness. What? You know what? His shoulders sagged. For once, he didn't pretend, didn't deflect, didn't joke, because I believed it. The honesty surprised me. I appreciated it anyway. He continued, I grew up thinking success meant money. His voice sounded tired. My father worked 3 jobs. I listened quietly. We were always one emergency away from disaster. His eyes remained fixed on the yard. When people have money, they're safe. I nodded. I understand. No. He shook his head. You understand better than I do. That statement carried more truth than he realized. Military families understand uncertainty. Deployments, transfers, risk, loss. Nothing is guaranteed. Richard took a deep breath. I spent my entire life chasing security. He laughed bitterly. Somewhere along the way, I started confusing money with value. The words settled heavily between us. I thought about that. Then I asked softly and my family. His face tightened. I judged them. Why? Because they didn't fit the world I understood. For the first time, I saw genuine vulnerability. Not embarrassment, not pride. Vulnerability. The kind that appears when someone stops defending themselves. I looked toward the stars above our yard, then back at him. My father spent months away from home. Richard nodded. I know, he missed birthdays. Another nod. Anniversaries? Yes? Holidays? His eyes dropped. I continued, and he'd do it all again. The porch fell silent. Finally, I spoke the words that had been building inside me since the gala. You didn't insult my father. Richard looked up. He isn't here anymore. I felt emotion tightening my chest. You insulted every family that sacrificed alongside him. The words landed hard. I could see it. For several seconds, Richard simply sat there motionless. Then his eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, not movie tears, the kind older people recognize, the kind that come from regret. Real regret. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this. I looked at him carefully, and for the first time in weeks, I answered honestly. I don't know either. The admission hurt because it was true. 12 years of marriage doesn't unravel overnight. Neither does trust, neither does respect. Both are built slowly, and both can be damaged slowly too. Richard lowered his head. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not afraid of losing business, not afraid of public embarrassment, afraid of losing me. And as I sat there beneath the Charleston night sky, I quietly admitted something to myself. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure whether staying was the right choice. For nearly 2 weeks after our conversation on the porch, Richard changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. There was no grand speech, no desperate promises, no dramatic attempts to save our marriage. At my age, I've learned to be cautious around words. Words are easy, change is hard, and real change takes time. What caught my attention wasn't what Richard said, it was what he started doing. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs expecting to find him watching financial news. Instead, he was sitting at the kitchen table reading something. Several sheets of paper lay spread before him. Old documents, copies of military records, photographs, letters. I recognized them immediately. They had belonged to my father. Richard looked up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, Did your father really write all these letters during deployments? I nodded. Every week he looked down again. The pages seemed fragile in his large hands. I had no idea. There was that phrase again. I had no idea. For years, those words might have irritated me. Now they sounded different. Now they sounded like the beginning of understanding. Over the next several weeks, Richard kept asking questions. Questions he should have asked years earlier. Questions most husbands ask when they genuinely want to know their wives. What was deployment like? How often did my father come home? How did my mother handle the absences? What was it like growing up in military housing? Why had I chosen the Navy? What did service mean to me? At first, I answered cautiously. A part of me wondered whether this was temporary, whether guilt was driving his curiosity, but the questions kept coming, and they felt sincere. One evening, he surprised me. I called General Bradley. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. You what? Richard smiled awkwardly. He invited me to lunch. I stared. The same general who had unintentionally exposed him in front of Charleston's elite. Why? Richard laughed softly. Because I told him I needed an education. For the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling. Lunch turned into 3 hours, then another meeting, then another. General Bradley became something of an unexpected mentor. Not because Richard wanted military connections, because he wanted perspective. One afternoon after returning home, Richard sat beside me on the couch. The expression on his face looked thoughtful. "Do you know what the general told me today?" "What?" Richard shook his head slowly. He said, "Your father never cared who got credit." I smiled. "That's true." He said, "Most people spend their lives trying to be important." I nodded, and the people who actually matter rarely talk about themselves. The room grew quiet. Richard stared toward the window. "I've spent my whole life doing the opposite." There was no self-pity in his voice, just honesty, and honesty is where growth begins. A month later, Richard asked me a question I never expected. "Would you take me somewhere?" "Where?" He hesitated, then answered softly, "Arlington." For several seconds, I simply looked at him. My father wasn't buried there, but many people he served with were. Many members of our extended military family rested there. Arlington National Cemetery is sacred ground to anyone who has worn the uniform. I had visited several times. Richard never had. 2 weeks later, we flew to Washington. The morning was cool and overcast. The cemetery stretched before us in perfect rows of white headstones, orderly, quiet, endless. No matter how many times you visit Arlington, it affects you. The sight humbles you, reminds you how many people carried burdens most Americans never see. Richard walked silently beside me. For nearly an hour, he barely spoke. We passed families visiting loved ones, veterans standing quietly, children asking questions, flags moving gently in the breeze. Eventually, Richard stopped. He stared across hundreds of white markers, his eyes filled with emotion. "I've never seen anything like this." I nodded. "Most people haven't." He swallowed hard. "So many. Yes, so many sacrifices." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The place itself provided the lesson. Later that afternoon, we sat on a bench overlooking part of the cemetery. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then Richard surprised me again. "I owe your father an apology." I turned toward him. "He isn't here." "I know." His voice trembled slightly, but I owe him one anyway. I waited. Richard looked down at his hands. "When I mocked your family, I thought I was judging social status." He laughed sadly. "I wasn't." "What were you judging?" He looked at me. "The values that made you who you are." My throat tightened, because that was exactly the truth. Not just about my father, about all of them. My mother, my grandfather, the generations before them, the values that shaped me. Duty, humility, service, responsibility, sacrifice, things that don't show up on bank statements, yet somehow matter more than money ever could. That evening, back at the hotel, Richard sat quietly for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated, then asked the question that mattered most. "Do you think your father would forgive me?" I stared at him. Not because the question surprised me, because I already knew the answer. I thought about my father, the countless sailors he had mentored, the mistakes he'd forgiven, the grace he'd extended, the patience he'd shown. Then I smiled softly. Yes. Richard looked relieved, but the words stopped him. I continued. "He'd expect you to learn from it." Richard nodded immediately. "I have. I believed him. Not because he said it, because I had watched it happen day by day, conversation by conversation, choice by choice." When we returned to Charleston, something subtle had changed. The tension between us hadn't completely disappeared. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. Neither does respect. But for the first time in a long time, we were moving in the right direction. Not backward, forward, together. And as I looked at the old Navy watch resting on my wrist one evening, I realized something important. The greatest revenge had never been public humiliation. It wasn't watching Richard feel embarrassed. It wasn't seeing him criticized. Real revenge was something much quieter. Watching someone finally understand the value of what they once dismissed. Watching ignorance become wisdom. Watching pride become humility. Watching a man become better than he was before. And for the first time since the gala, I began to wonder whether our story might still have a hopeful ending. A year later, I found myself standing in the same ballroom where everything had begun. The same crystal chandeliers, the same harbor view, the same annual charity gala, even the same string quartet played softly near the stage. Yet somehow the room felt entirely different. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Maybe both. I adjusted the sleeve of my evening dress and glanced at the old Navy watch on my wrist. My father's watch. The watch that had quietly carried his legacy into that ballroom a year earlier. The watch that had revealed truths neither Richard nor I were prepared to face. A year, 12 short months. And yet it felt much longer, because growth has a way of stretching time. Richard approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to me. His smile was relaxed, natural, not the carefully polished smile he used to wear at social events, a genuine one. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be?" he chuckled. "That's usually your answer." Because it's usually true. We shared a laugh, a simple moment, the kind married couples often overlook. Yet, after the previous year, I appreciated those moments more than ever. Richard had changed, not perfectly. Nobody changes perfectly. At 62 years old, he still loved business, still enjoyed ambitious projects, still appreciated success, but success no longer defined his entire worldview. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was visible in small choices, the most meaningful kind. He had begun volunteering with veteran organizations, quietly, without publicity, without posting photos, without announcing it to anyone. He simply showed up week after week, month after month, helping where he could, learning where he couldn't, listening more than talking. The first time I saw him unloading supplies at a veterans' housing program, I nearly cried. Not because he was volunteering, because nobody had asked him to. Several months earlier, General Bradley had invited us to lunch. The 3 of us sat together overlooking Charleston Harbor. The conversation drifted from military history to family, aging, and purpose. At one point, the general leaned back and smiled at Richard. "You've come a long way." Richard laughed. "I had a good teacher." The general pointed toward me. "No." Then he pointed toward the watch. "Your teacher was wearing that watch long before either of us met her." The 3 of us sat quietly for a moment. Then General Bradley added something I'll never forget. "The greatest leaders don't leave behind wealth." He paused. "They leave behind values." Even now, those words echo in my mind because they're true. As the gala continued, guests moved through the ballroom. Some recognized me, some didn't. That was perfectly fine. I've never needed attention. Neither had my father. Across the room, I noticed several veterans gathered near a display honoring local service members. Richard was speaking with them, not as a businessman, not as a donor, simply as another human being, listening, learning, respecting. A year ago, I never would have imagined that scene, yet there it was, real, quiet, meaningful. Later in the evening, the event organizer stepped onto the stage. After welcoming guests, she invited several community leaders to stand for recognition. Richard's name was among them. He looked surprised, genuinely surprised. As polite applause filled the room, he reluctantly stood. Then something happened that touched me deeply. The organizer asked each honoree to briefly introduce themselves. One by one, they spoke about businesses, organizations, and accomplishments. Eventually, it was Richard's turn. He walked to the microphone. The ballroom grew quiet. I watched him carefully, curious what he would say. A year earlier, he would have listed achievements, projects, investments, professional successes. Instead, he smiled and looked toward me. Then he said, "My name is Richard Collins." A brief pause followed. "I'm fortunate to be married to an extraordinary woman." I felt my face grow warm. The room laughed softly. Richard continued, "She comes from a family that spent generations serving others." His voice grew steadier. "A family that taught me an important lesson." The ballroom remained silent, listening. Real greatness isn't measured by money. He glanced toward me. It's measured by character. I felt tears forming. Not because of the audience, not because of the applause, because I knew how difficult those words had been for him to earn. He wasn't repeating something he had heard. He believed it. That made all the difference. After the event ended, we stepped outside onto the harbor terrace. The night air felt cool. Boats moved slowly across the dark water. City lights shimmered in the distance. For several minutes, we simply stood together. No speeches, no dramatic declarations, just peace. Finally, Richard spoke. "You know something?" "What?" "I used to think your father was the most impressive person in this story." I smiled. "He probably is." Richard shook his head. "No." I looked at him. He squeezed my hand. "You are." Emotion caught in my throat. "Why?" His answer came immediately. "Because you could have humiliated me." I laughed softly. "You handled that yourself." He laughed too. Then his expression became serious. "You could have walked away." I didn't respond because he was right. There had been moments when leaving seemed easier. Moments when anger felt justified. Moments when bitterness would have been understandable. Yet my father had taught me something important. People are more than their worst moments. Sometimes they deserve the opportunity to become better. Not always, but sometimes Richard had earned that opportunity, and thankfully he had used it well. As we stood there overlooking Charleston Harbor, I thought about my father, my grandfather, my mother, the generations who had shaped me. None of them had been wealthy. None of them had sought recognition. Yet their influence remained alive. Not through monuments, not through headlines, through values. Values passed from one life to another, one family member to another, one generation to the next. That is how legacies survive. Not in bank accounts, in people. I looked down at my father's watch. The hands continued moving steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Time passing just as it always had. For the first time since his death, I felt something close to peace. Not because people finally knew who he was. He never would have cared about that. Because the lessons he spent a lifetime teaching were still alive, still working, still changing lives. Even Richard's, especially Richard's. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can hope to leave behind. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly served, sacrificed, or shaped your life, without asking for recognition, take a moment to think about them today. And if you've ever learned an important lesson from someone you once misunderstood, I'd love for you to share that experience. Stories like these help us remember what truly matters. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves. Take care of one another. And never underestimate the quiet people in the room.